Hello, and welcome to tonight's gentle journey through Scripture. Have you ever wondered about the man who never spoke a single recorded word in the Gospels, yet played one of the most crucial roles in the greatest story ever told? Tonight, we're going to discover the quiet strength and faithful heart of Joseph of Nazareth, the earthly father of Jesus. Over the next couple of hours, we'll walk through Joseph's extraordinary life, from his days as a respected carpenter in Nazareth, through the shocking news of Mary's pregnancy, to his role as protector and provider for the Holy Family. We'll experience his journey to Bethlehem, the flight to Egypt, and those precious years of raising the Son of God in a workshop where patient hands shaped both timber and character. Tonight, we journey not to a palace or a battlefield, but to the quiet workshop of a carpenter, where wood shavings curl on the floor and the scent of cedar fills the air. Joseph was, in many ways, like so many of us, someone trying to do the right thing, to follow God's will, even when that will seemed to ask the impossible. He was a craftsman who worked with his hands, someone who understood the satisfaction of turning raw wood into something beautiful, a man who measured twice and cut once, who built things to last. Before you get comfortable tonight, take a moment to settle in, adjust your pillow, pull up your blanket, and perhaps, if you listen carefully, you might hear the distant sound of Joseph's plane smoothing a piece of olive wood, or the gentle tap of his hammer in the dim light of his workshop. So tonight, you and I will sit quietly in the carpenter's shop, breathing in the peaceful rhythm of honest work and discovering the gentle strength of a man who helped raise the Son of God with patience, love, and unwavering devotion. Let's begin our story in the small town of Nazareth, where Joseph lived and worked as a carpenter. Every morning, he would rise early, while the air was still cool and the streets were quiet, and make his way to the workshop attached to his home. Joseph was the son of Jacob, and through his family line, he could trace his ancestry all the way back to King David. But that royal heritage seemed very distant in his everyday life. Here in Nazareth, he was simply known as Joseph the carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, who could fix a broken plough or build a sturdy table, who was honest in his dealings and reliable in his work. His workshop was a simple stone room, with tools hanging neatly on the walls and wood stacked carefully in the corners. The smell of cedar and olive wood filled the air, and sawdust covered the floor from the previous day's work. This was Joseph's world, a place where he felt at home, where he could take a rough piece of timber and slowly, patiently, shape it into something useful and beautiful. The work of a carpenter in those days was different from what we might imagine today. Joseph didn't just work with wood. He was what the Greeks called a tekton, which meant he was a craftsman who could work with stone, repair tools, even help with construction projects around the village. When someone needed a yoke for their oxen, they came to Joseph. When a family wanted a chest to store their belongings, they brought their request to his workshop. Joseph had learned his trade from his father, just as his father had learned from his father before him. It was the way of things in those days. Sons followed in their father's footsteps, learning not just the skills of the trade, but the importance of doing good work, of being honest in your dealings, of building things that would last. As Joseph worked, he could hear the sounds of Nazareth waking up around him, women walking to the well to draw water for the day, children playing in the narrow streets, men heading out to their fields or their own workshops. It was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where your reputation mattered, where people remembered whether you kept your word or not. The town of Nazareth is just beginning to stir around him. Women emerge from their homes with clay jars, making their way to the village well for the day's water. Their voices carry on the morning air. Soft conversations about children and bread, about the small concerns that make up the fabric of daily life. Children dart between the narrow streets, their laughter echoing off stone walls, while men prepare for their own day's labour in fields or workshops throughout the village. But Joseph's reputation precedes him as he steps into the growing light. Neighbours nod with respect as they pass, recognising not just his skill as a craftsman, but his character as a man. In a small town like Nazareth, reputation is everything, and Joseph has built his carefully, one honest transaction at a time, one well-crafted piece at a time, one act of integrity at a time. The Greek word used in Scripture to describe Joseph's profession is tekton, which means more than just a carpenter. It suggests someone who is a craftsman, a builder, someone who works with stone as easily as wood, who can repair a broken plough, construct a wedding chest, or frame a new room for a growing family. These are skills that require not just strength, but intelligence, planning, the ability to see the finished product in the raw material. As the sun climbs higher, Joseph returns to his workbench, running his hand along a piece of acacia wood that will become a yoke for oxen. The farmer who commissioned it needs the yoke to be perfectly balanced, comfortable for his animals, strong enough to last for years of hard work. Joseph understands this responsibility. He knows that his craftsmanship will affect not just the comfort of the oxen, but the success of the harvest, the prosperity of a family, the feeding of children. This is the rhythm of Joseph's life before the angel comes, before everything changes. The steady tap of his hammer, the whisper of his plane across wood, the satisfying sound of pieces fitting together perfectly. He measures twice and cuts once, not just because wood is precious, but because precision is a reflection of character, and character, in Joseph's world, is everything. The tools of his trade are simple but effective. A bronze adze for rough shaping, iron chisels for detail work, a wooden mallet that fits his hand perfectly, a measuring rod marked with the ancient cubit, and a plumb line to ensure everything is straight and true. These tools, passed down from his father, will one day be passed to his son, along with the knowledge of how to use them, and more importantly, the wisdom of when to use them. As the afternoon heat builds, Joseph takes his rest in the shade of his workshop, sharing a simple meal of bread and olives, perhaps a piece of cheese, while his neighbours do the same. This is when the real conversations happen, when news travels through the village, when friendships are maintained and community bonds are strengthened. Joseph listens more than he speaks, but when he does offer his thoughts, people listen, because they know his words, like his work, are measured and true. In the evening, as the sun sets behind the hills of Galilee, Joseph cleans his tools, sweeps the sawdust from his workshop floor, and prepares for another day. There's a peace in this routine, a satisfaction in honest work completed, in projects begun and finished, in the knowledge that his hands have created something that will outlast him. This is the man God chose, not a scholar, not a priest, not a king, but a craftsman, someone who understands the value of patience, the importance of getting things right, the beauty that emerges when skill meets dedication, someone who knows that the most important things in life are often built slowly, carefully, with attention to detail and respect for the materials you've been given. And so, as we sit quietly in Joseph's workshop, feeling the smooth wood beneath our hands, breathing in the scent of cedar and olive, we begin to understand why God would entrust the care of his son to a carpenter, to a man who knew how to build things that would last, how to shape raw material into something beautiful, how to work with his hands and love with his heart. Imagine Joseph, standing a little straighter as he walks through Nazareth's narrow streets, his step lighter than usual, his eyes holding a new brightness that his neighbours can't help but notice. Something has changed in the carpenter's quiet world, something that makes him hum softly as he works, something that brings a gentle smile to his weathered face as he shapes wood with hands that seem to move with extra care. Mary, daughter of Joachim and Anne, has agreed to become his wife. The betrothal, or kiddushin as it was known in Hebrew, was far more than what we might think of as an engagement today. In the world of first-century Judaism, betrothal was a sacred covenant, almost as binding as marriage itself. It was a promise made before God and community, sealed with ceremony and witnessed by families who had prayed over this union for months, perhaps years. Joseph remembers the day her father first approached him. The conversation began, as these conversations always did, with talk of the weather, the harvest, the state of repair of the local synagogue. But Joseph could sense something more in Joachim's manner, a careful consideration in his words, the way a man speaks when he's measuring not just your skill with tools, but your character as a human being. Joseph, Joachim had said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a father's love and concern. You are known as a righteous man. Your work speaks of patience, of integrity. Your conduct in the community brings honour to your family name. The older man paused, perhaps remembering his own youth, his own hopes and fears about the future. I have a daughter. And there it was, the conversation that would change everything, the careful negotiation that wasn't really about money or property, though those practical matters had their place, but about something far more precious, the future happiness and security of a young woman who was loved beyond measure. Mary was perhaps 14 or 15 years old, young by our standards, but not unusual for her time and place. What was unusual was her character. Even as a girl, she was known for her devotion to God, her kindness to neighbours, her willingness to help with the younger children, her gentle way of speaking that never carried gossip or harsh judgment. The women of Nazareth watched her with approval, seeing in her the qualities that would make not just a good wife, but a woman who would strengthen her husband and bless her children. Joseph had noticed her, of course. How could he not? She moved through the village with a grace that wasn't quite like other girls her age. There was something thoughtful about her, something that suggested depths beneath the surface. When she drew water at the well, she often lingered to help elderly women with their heavy jars. When children fell and scraped their knees, she was quick to comfort them, to clean their wounds with gentle hands. But it was more than kindness that drew Joseph's attention. There was something about the way she listened during the Torah readings at synagogue, the way her lips moved silently as she committed verses to memory, the way she seemed to carry a quiet joy, as if she knew something about God's goodness that others had forgotten. The formal betrothal ceremony took place on a warm evening, with families gathered in Joachim's courtyard. Oil lamps flickered in the growing darkness, casting dancing shadows on faces bright with celebration. Joseph, wearing his finest tunic, stood before the community elders as they spoke the ancient blessings, as they invoked God's protection and favour on this union, as they prayed for children and grandchildren, for a home filled with laughter and learning. When the cup of wine was passed, and Joseph and Mary drank from it together, something passed between them that went beyond mere ceremony. Their eyes met over the rim of the cup, and in that moment, Joseph saw not just the girl he was pledging to marry, but the woman she would become, the partner who would walk beside him through whatever joys and sorrows lay ahead. The year that followed, the time between betrothal and marriage, was filled with preparation and anticipation. Joseph worked with new energy, saving money for their future home, crafting furniture that would fill their rooms, a marriage chest where Mary would store her finest linens, a dining table where they would share thousands of meals, shelves for the scrolls they would read to their children. In the evenings, when work was done, Joseph would often walk past Mary's house, hoping for a glimpse of her, perhaps a few words of conversation as she helped her mother with the evening chores. These were precious moments, carefully chaperoned but deeply meaningful, when they began to know each other's hearts, to share their dreams for the future, to speak of the children they hoped to have, the kind of home they wanted to build together. Mary would tell him about her prayers, about the passages of Scripture that brought her comfort, about her dreams of raising children who would love God and serve their community with generous hearts. Joseph would share his vision of expanding his workshop, perhaps taking on an apprentice, building not just furniture and farm tools, but a reputation that would provide security for his family. They spoke of simple things, but in those simple things lay the foundation of a life together. The way Mary's face lit up when she talked about teaching children their letters. The way Joseph's voice grew warm when he described the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with his hands. The shared understanding that their marriage would be built on more than attraction or convenience, but on a mutual commitment to serve God and each other. As winter gave way to spring, and spring blossomed into summer, their wedding day drew closer. Joseph found himself working later into the evening, not just because there was much to prepare, but because he was almost too excited to sleep, too filled with anticipation for the life that was about to begin, too grateful to the God who had blessed him with a woman like Mary, who had given him the chance to build something lasting and good. And so, as we sit in the growing dusk of that ancient world, listening to the distant sounds of families gathering for their evening meals, we can almost feel Joseph's happiness, his sense of rightness about the path that lay before him, his deep contentment in knowing that soon, very soon, he would take Mary as his wife, and together they would build a life that honoured God and brought joy to their community. None of them knew, in those sweet days of preparation and promise, what lay ahead. None of them could have imagined the extraordinary role they were about to play in the greatest story ever told. They were simply two young people in love, planning a future together, trusting in God's goodness, and believing, as young people always do, that their love was strong enough to overcome whatever challenges might come. The news came to Joseph on what had started as an ordinary day. He was in his workshop, smoothing the edges of a wooden bowl, when Mary's father Joachim appeared in his doorway. But something was different about the older man. His face was troubled, his usual warm greeting replaced by an awkward silence that filled the small workshop like smoke. "Joseph," Joachim began, then stopped, as if the words he needed to say were too heavy to lift. "We need to talk." Joseph set down his tools, sensing that whatever was coming would change everything. In a small town like Nazareth, when conversations began this way, it usually meant trouble. And trouble, once it started, had a way of spreading through the community like ripples in a still pond. "It's about Mary," Joachim continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She's with child." The words hit Joseph like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was hearing. Mary, his Mary, the girl he was pledged to marry, the one he had dreamed of building a life with, was carrying someone else's child. The room seemed to spin around him, all his carefully laid plans, all his hopes for their future together, seemed to crumble like sawdust in his hands. He had worked so hard to prepare for their marriage, saving money, building furniture for their home, dreaming of the children they would have together. And now... "Joseph," Joachim said gently, "I know what you must be thinking, but Mary, she says..." The older man paused, struggling with words that even he seemed to find hard to believe. "She says the child is from God, that an angel came to her." Joseph stared at the floor, his mind racing. An angel? In this day and age? Such things happened in the old stories, to Abraham and Moses and the prophets of old. But here? Now? To a young girl in Nazareth? It seemed impossible. And yet, this was Mary, the girl who prayed with such devotion, who knew the scriptures better than many of the men in the synagogue, who had never told a lie that Joseph had ever heard of. But even if it were true, who would believe such a story? In a small town where gossip travelled faster than the morning light, where a woman's reputation was more fragile than the thinnest pottery, what would people say? What would they think? And more importantly, what was Joseph supposed to do? According to the law, Joseph had every right to divorce Mary publicly, to expose her apparent unfaithfulness before the community, to let everyone know that he was not responsible for her condition. It would clear his own name, protect his reputation, allow him to start over with someone else. But the thought of subjecting Mary to that kind of public shame, of watching her face the accusations and whispers and pointing fingers, made Joseph feel sick. Whatever had happened, however this had come about, he couldn't bear the thought of adding to her burden. Mary was still the gentle, devout girl he had fallen in love with. That much hadn't changed, even if everything else had. For days, Joseph wrestled with the decision. He barely ate, hardly slept, couldn't concentrate on his work. His neighbours began to notice, asking if he was feeling well, offering remedies for what they assumed was some physical ailment. If only they knew. Joseph thought that his illness was of the heart, of the spirit, of a future that had suddenly become uncertain. He considered his options carefully, as he did everything else in his life. He could divorce Mary quietly, with the minimum legal requirements, allowing her to return to her father's house without the spectacle of a public trial. It would be the kind thing to do, the merciful thing, even if it meant the end of his own dreams of marriage and family. Night after night, Joseph lay on his sleeping mat, staring at the ceiling, praying for wisdom, for guidance, for some sign of what God wanted him to do. The questions circled in his mind like birds that wouldn't settle. Was Mary telling the truth about the angel? Could such a thing really happen? And if it could, what did it mean for him? What was his role in this impossible story? It was on one of these sleepless nights that the answer came, not through his worried thoughts, not through careful reasoning, but through a dream that was more vivid and real than any dream he had ever experienced. In the dream, a figure appeared to him, bright and terrible and beautiful all at once, filling Joseph's vision with light that didn't hurt his eyes, speaking with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Joseph, son of David," the angel said, and Joseph knew, without being told, that this was a messenger from the Most High God. "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child she carries has been conceived by the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." The angel's words washed over Joseph like water over parched ground, answering questions he had been afraid to ask, solving problems he couldn't have solved on his own. This child, this impossible child, was not the result of unfaithfulness or shame, but of God's own plan, God's own miracle, and more than that. Joseph had a part to play, not just as an observer, not just as someone who happened to be nearby when God acted, but as the earthly father of this special child, as the one who would give him a name, who would protect him and provide for him, who would teach him to walk and talk and work with his hands. When Joseph woke from the dream, the morning light was already streaming through his window, but more than that, light was streaming into his heart. The confusion and pain of the past week seemed to lift like morning mist, replaced by a sense of purpose, of calling, of being chosen for something far greater than he had ever imagined. He rose quickly, washed his face, and walked through the quiet streets to Joachim's house. When Mary saw him coming, her eyes were filled with hope and fear in equal measure, waiting to hear what decision he had made, what choice he had come to. "Mary," Joseph said, taking her hands in his, feeling their familiar warmth, their gentle strength. "I believe you. I believe the angel, and I want you to know, nothing has changed between us. Nothing important. Anyway, we'll be married as planned, and this child, this gift from God, will be our son." The relief on Mary's face was like sunrise after the longest night, and Joseph knew, with a certainty that went deeper than understanding, that he had made the right choice. God had spoken, and Joseph had listened, and now their lives were about to become part of the greatest story ever told. It was the kind of news that changed everything, even though it came wrapped in the ordinary language of government proclamation. A messenger had arrived in Nazareth, dusty from the road, carrying a decree from Caesar Augustus in Rome. Every person in the empire was to return to their ancestral hometown to be counted for the census. Joseph heard the news in the marketplace, along with the groans and complaints of his fellow townspeople. Travel was never easy, but for Joseph, the timing couldn't have been worse. Mary was now very pregnant, her baby due any day, and the journey to Bethlehem would take them nearly a week on foot, through rough terrain and uncertain weather. "Bethlehem," Joseph murmured to himself, thinking of his ancestor David, who had been born in that small town south of Jerusalem. It had been generations since anyone in Joseph's family had lived there, but the Roman records were thorough, and Caesar's word was law. Like it or not, they would have to make the journey. That evening, Joseph sat with Mary in her father's house, discussing their options. Mary's condition was obvious now, her belly round and full, her movements slow and careful, the thought of her walking for days on rocky roads, sleeping on the hard ground, facing the uncertainty of finding shelter in a crowded town, filled Joseph with worry. Maybe I could go alone, Joseph suggested, though he knew even as he said it that it wouldn't work. The Romans wanted to count families, not just individuals. And besides, the baby could come at any time. He couldn't leave Mary behind. Not now. Mary placed her hand on his arm, her touch gentle and reassuring. "We'll manage," she said quietly. "God has brought us this far. He won't abandon us now." Joseph marvelled at her faith, her calmness in the face of uncertainty. Here she was, a young woman facing her first childbirth, about to undertake a difficult journey in her condition. And she spoke of God's faithfulness as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The preparations took several days. Joseph borrowed a donkey from a neighbour, a sturdy little animal that could carry their supplies and, when needed, carry Mary when walking became too difficult. He packed carefully, taking only what they absolutely needed, a few changes of clothes, food for the journey, his tools in case he needed to find work in Bethlehem, and a small pouch of coins he had been saving for their new life together. Mary's mother fussed over the preparations, packing extra blankets, preparing special foods that would keep well on the road, giving her daughter advice about childbirth, about caring for a newborn, about a dozen other things that mothers worry about when their daughters are leaving home. The morning of their departure was crisp and clear, with the kind of bright sunshine that made even a difficult journey seem possible. Joseph loaded their belongings onto the donkey, checked and rechecked everything, and helped Mary settle herself for the long walk ahead. The first day wasn't too bad. They made good time on the well-travelled road, stopping frequently to rest, sharing meals with other travellers who were also heading south for the census. There was a sense of shared purpose, of everyone being caught up in the same inconvenient necessity that made the journey feel less lonely. But as the days passed, the journey became more difficult. The roads grew rougher as they left the familiar territory of Galilee, winding through hills and valleys that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them. Mary's steps grew slower, her need for rest more frequent, and Joseph found himself watching her constantly, worried about every grimace, every pause, every hand pressed to her back. Other travellers passed them, some on horseback, some with wagons, most of them in a hurry to reach their destinations. A few offered words of encouragement or shared their water when they stopped to rest, but most were focused on their own journeys, their own problems, their own need to comply with Caesar's decree and return home as quickly as possible. Joseph had never felt so protective of anyone in his life. Every evening, as they made camp beside the road, he would spread their blankets in the most sheltered spot he could find, build a small fire to keep Mary warm, and stay awake long into the night, listening for any sounds that might signal danger. Bandits were known to prey on travellers, especially small groups like theirs, and Joseph kept his carpenter's tools close at hand, ready to defend Mary and their unborn child if necessary. By the fourth day, Mary was riding the donkey more than walking, her face pale with exhaustion, her breathing laboured. Joseph walked beside her, one hand on the donkey's bridle, the other ready to steady Mary if she needed help. They were making slower progress now, but Joseph didn't care. The only thing that mattered was keeping Mary safe, getting her to Bethlehem and finding a place where their baby could be born safely. As they crested a hill on the 5th day, Joseph saw it. Bethlehem spread out below them, its white stone buildings gleaming in the afternoon sun. The town was much larger than he had expected, and much more crowded. Even from a distance, he could see the roads leading into the town were packed with travellers, families like his own, all converging on this ancient city of David to fulfill Caesar's command. "We made it," Mary said softly, her voice filled with relief and exhaustion. "We're here." Joseph nodded, but as they drew closer to the town, his relief began to mix with new worry. Where would they stay? How would they find room among all these people? And most importantly, what would they do if Mary's labour began before they could find proper shelter? The sun was setting as they finally reached Bethlehem's gates, casting long shadows across the crowded streets. Joseph helped Mary down from the donkey, feeling the weight of her exhaustion, seeing the way she leaned on him for support. Tomorrow, he would worry about the census, about finding work, about all the practical details of their situation. Tonight, his only concern was finding a place where Mary could rest, where their child could be born, where this part of their extraordinary journey could come to its promised end. The city of David stretched out before them, crowded and noisy and overwhelming, but also full of possibility, full of the promise that somewhere in its ancient streets, God's plan would unfold exactly as it was meant to. The streets of Bethlehem were unlike anything Joseph had ever seen. Everywhere he looked, families were setting up makeshift camps, spreading blankets in doorways, crowding around wells, searching for any available space to spend the night. The census had brought thousands of people to this small town, and it was clear that Bethlehem was not prepared for such an influx of visitors. Joseph led Mary and their donkey through the narrow streets, stopping at every inn, every boarding house, every place that might offer shelter for the night. But the answer was always the same. "No room. We're full. Try somewhere else." With each rejection, Joseph felt his anxiety growing. Mary was walking more slowly now, one hand pressed to her back, her breathing shallow and careful. She hadn't said anything, but Joseph could see in her eyes that something was changing, that their time was running short. At the 3rd inn they tried. The innkeeper was kinder than the others, but his answer was the same. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at Mary with genuine sympathy. "I wish I could help, but every room is taken. Some families are sleeping 3 to a bed. There's just no space." Joseph felt a flash of frustration, of helplessness. "Please," he said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "My wife. She's about to give birth. Surely there must be somewhere." The innkeeper studied them for a moment, taking in Mary's condition, Joseph's worried face, the donkey loaded with their few possessions. Something in his expression softened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There is one possibility," he said slowly. "Behind the inn. I have a stable. It's where we keep the animals, not fit for people. Really. But it's shelter. It's clean, and it's private. If you're truly desperate." Joseph looked at Mary, seeing the relief in her eyes at the prospect of any shelter at all. A stable wasn't what they had hoped for, wasn't what their child deserved, but it was better than the street. It was a roof over their heads, walls to keep out the wind, a place where they could be alone when the time came. "Yes," Joseph said quickly. "Yes, we'll take it. Thank you." The innkeeper led them around the back of the building, through a wooden gate, into a small courtyard where several caves had been carved into the hillside. These served as stables, providing shelter for the animals that travellers brought with them. The innkeeper pointed to one of the caves, smaller than the others, but clean and dry. "This one's empty tonight," he said. "I'll bring you some fresh straw, and a lamp. It's not much, but it's perfect," Mary said softly, and Joseph could hear the genuine gratitude in her voice. "Thank you for your kindness." As the innkeeper walked away, Joseph helped Mary into the cave, spreading their blankets on the fresh straw, arranging their few possessions, trying to make the space as comfortable as possible. The cave was warm, protected from the wind, and surprisingly peaceful. Outside, they could hear the noise of the crowded inn, the voices of travellers, the sounds of a town stretched beyond its limits. But here, in this quiet place, there was a sense of calm, of sanctuary. It was well past midnight when Mary's labour began in earnest. Joseph had dozed fitfully, starting awake at every sound, every movement, every change in Mary's breathing. When she gripped his hand, her face tight with pain, he knew their waiting was over. Joseph had never felt so helpless in his life. All his skills with wood and tools, all his knowledge of building and fixing and creating, meant nothing now. This was woman's work, this bringing of life into the world, and all he could do was hold Mary's hand, offer her water, speak gentle words of encouragement, and pray. The animals in the nearby stables seemed to sense that something important was happening. The donkeys and oxen moved restlessly in their stalls, occasionally lowing softly, as if they too were waiting for this moment, this birth that would change everything. And then, as the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, it was over. Mary's final cry of pain gave way to a different sound, a thin, strong wail that filled the cave with new life. Joseph looked down at the tiny form in Mary's arms and felt his heart stop. This was the child the angel had promised, the son who would save his people from their sins, the one conceived by the Holy Spirit, the one they were to call Jesus. But looking at him now, Joseph saw simply a baby, red-faced and wrinkled, perfectly formed, absolutely beautiful. "He's so small," Joseph whispered, reaching out one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. Immediately, those miniature fingers closed around his, gripping with surprising strength, and Joseph felt something shift inside his chest, a love so fierce and protective that it took his breath away. Mary smiled, exhausted but radiant, her eyes fixed on her son's face. "Hello, Jesus," she murmured, and the name, spoken for the first time, seemed to fill the cave with light. Joseph found himself laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened, by the trust God had placed in him, by the incredible gift of this moment. This child, this tiny boy, was the son of the Most High God, and yet he was also their son, the child they would raise and protect and love. Working quickly, Joseph helped Mary clean the baby, using water from their travel supplies, soft cloths they had brought for this purpose. There was no proper cradle, no nursery prepared, but Joseph remembered seeing a stone manger in the corner of the cave, a feeding trough for the animals. He cleaned it carefully, lined it with the softest cloth they had, and gently placed Jesus inside. The baby settled immediately, as if the makeshift cradle had been prepared especially for him, as if this humble stable, this quiet cave, was exactly where he was meant to be born. Joseph knelt beside the manger, watching his son sleep, marvelling at the perfection of his tiny features, the rise and fall of his chest, the miracle of his very existence. Outside, Bethlehem was waking up, people beginning their day, getting ready to register for the census, going about their business, completely unaware that in a humble stable, the Saviour of the world had just been born. The most important moment in human history had happened quietly, in a place meant for animals, witnessed only by a young mother, a carpenter, and the gentle creatures who shared their shelter. And Joseph, looking at his sleeping son, understanding for the first time the enormous responsibility that had been placed in his hands, whispered a prayer of thanksgiving, of acceptance, of complete surrender to God's will. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges they would face, whatever this extraordinary life would bring, he was ready. He was a father now, and nothing would ever be the same. Joseph had barely settled into sleep when he heard voices outside the stable, low and urgent, mixed with the sound of sandaled feet on stone. His first instinct was to protect, to position himself between Mary and the baby and whatever might be coming. In those days, travellers were vulnerable, especially when they had so little to defend themselves with. But as the voices grew closer, Joseph realized there was something different about them, something that didn't sound threatening. These weren't the rough voices of bandits or the official tones of Roman soldiers. These sounded like working men, men like himself, tired from their labour, but excited about something, urgent to share news that couldn't wait until morning. "Please," one of the voices called softly through the stable entrance, "we're looking for the baby, the one born tonight, the one the angels told us about." Angels? Joseph sat up straighter, his heart beginning to race. He looked at Mary, who was awake now, holding Jesus close to her chest, her eyes wide with wonder and just a touch of fear. What was happening? Who were these men? And what did they know about angels? "We won't hurt you," another voice added, younger than the first, breathless with excitement. "We're just shepherds from the fields outside town. But tonight, something incredible happened. We had to come. We had to see." Joseph made his decision, rising carefully so as not to disturb the baby, and stepping toward the entrance of the cave. In the moonlight, he could see them. Perhaps 6 men, their clothes rough and worn, their faces weathered by years of outdoor work, but their eyes were bright with something Joseph had never seen before, a kind of joy that seemed to light them from within. The oldest of the shepherds stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "Sir, forgive us for disturbing you, but we had to come. Tonight, we were watching our flocks, just like any other night, when suddenly the sky filled with light, and an angel appeared to us." Joseph felt his breath catch. Another angel? Another messenger from God? The shepherd continued, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to tell the story. "The angel told us not to be afraid, and then he said that tonight, in the city of David, a Saviour has been born, Christ the Lord, and he gave us a sign. He said we would find the baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." The shepherd's eyes moved past Joseph to the stone feeding trough where Jesus lay sleeping. And Joseph saw recognition dawn on his face, saw wonder replace excitement, saw a grown man nearly brought to tears by the sight of a newborn baby. "That's him," the shepherd whispered. "That's the one, isn't it?" Before Joseph could answer, Mary's voice came from behind him, gentle and welcoming. "Please, come in, come and see him." One by one, the shepherds entered the stable, their rough hands suddenly careful, their voices dropped to whispers, their weathered faces soft with awe. They gathered around the manger, looking down at Jesus, and Joseph watched as each of them seemed to understand, without being told, that they were in the presence of something holy, something that would change everything. The youngest shepherd knelt beside the manger, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. The angel said he would be good news of great joy for all people. He said softly, looking at him now, "I can believe it. I can feel it." "There were more angels," the oldest shepherd added, his voice filled with wonder at the memory. After the first one spoke, suddenly the whole sky was full of them, more than we could count, singing. He paused, as if trying to find words for something beyond description. They were singing, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." Joseph felt tears sting his eyes, understanding now that what had happened to him and Mary, this miraculous birth, this impossible child, was not meant to be kept secret. God was announcing it, proclaiming it, sending messengers to ordinary working people, shepherds who spent their nights watching over sheep, people who would understand the value of protecting something precious. The shepherds stayed for perhaps an hour, talking quietly with Mary and Joseph, sharing their story again and again, each detail more wonderful in the telling. They asked about the baby's name, about the circumstances of his birth, about whether Mary and Joseph had also seen angels, had also received messages from heaven. And when they finally prepared to leave, promising to keep watch over the news they had received, to spread the word carefully among those who would understand, Joseph walked with them to the entrance of the stable, watching as they made their way back through the sleeping town, back to their flocks, back to their ordinary lives that had been touched by the extraordinary. But before the oldest shepherd left, he turned back to Joseph, his face serious in the moonlight. "Sir," he said, "I've been watching sheep for 40 years, protecting them from wolves and thieves and storms. I know what it means to guard something precious. That child in there, he's not just precious to you and your wife. He's precious to all of us, to the whole world. God has given you a great responsibility." Joseph nodded, feeling the weight of those words, the truth of them settling into his heart. "I know," he said simply. "I'll protect him with my life." The shepherd smiled, a smile that seemed to carry all the joy of the angel's song. "I believe you will. God chose well when he chose you to be this child's father." After they were gone, Joseph returned to Mary and Jesus, finding them both awake. Jesus nursing contentedly while Mary hummed softly. The stable was quiet again, but it felt different now. charged with the knowledge that their secret was no longer secret, that God's plan was already beginning to unfold, that their son's life would touch more people than they could possibly imagine. As Joseph settled back onto his bed of straw, listening to his son's gentle breathing, he thought about the shepherd's words, about angels filling the sky with song, about good news of great joy for all people. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the census to complete, a place to live to find, a life to build in this crowded town. But tonight, in this humble stable, surrounded by the knowledge that heaven had taken notice of what had happened here, Joseph felt a peace deeper than any he had ever known. Their son was not just theirs. He belonged to the world, and the world, starting with a handful of shepherds, was already beginning to welcome him home. The wise men had been gone for 3 days, and Joseph was still thinking about their visit. They had been so different from the shepherds, educated men from distant lands, speaking of stars and prophecies, carrying gifts that seemed more suited to a king than a carpenter's son. Gold, frankincense, myrrh, treasures that Joseph had carefully hidden away, knowing they would need them for the journey ahead, though he didn't yet know where that journey would lead. Jesus was growing stronger each day, no longer the tiny newborn who had fit so perfectly in the stone manger. He was alert now, his eyes following movement, his little hands grasping at Mary's fingers when she held him. They had found lodging in Bethlehem, a small room above a baker's shop, and Joseph had begun to think about their future, about whether to stay here in the city of David or return to Nazareth, to the familiar workshop and the life they had planned. But God, it seemed, had other plans. The dream came suddenly, cutting through Joseph's sleep like a blade through cloth. Once again, he found himself face to face with an angel, the same messenger who had appeared to him months earlier, when Mary's pregnancy had seemed like an impossible crisis. But this time, the angel's voice carried urgency, a warning that made Joseph's blood run cold. "Get up," the angel commanded, his voice filled with divine authority. "Take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you to return, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." Joseph woke with a gasp, his heart pounding, the angel's words echoing in his mind with terrifying clarity. Herod, King Herod, the man who ruled Judea with an iron fist, who was known for his cruelty, his paranoia, his willingness to kill anyone he saw as a threat to his power, was hunting for Jesus. It made terrible sense now. The wise men's questions about the newborn king, their expensive gifts, their sudden departure without returning to Jerusalem as they had promised. Something had happened. Something that had made Herod see Jesus as a threat, and now their precious son was in mortal danger. Joseph shook Mary awake gently, his mind already racing through what they would need to do, how quickly they could leave, how far they would need to go to be safe. "Mary," he whispered urgently, "we have to go. Now, tonight." Mary sat up immediately, alert in the way new mothers learn to be, scanning the room for danger, her arms instinctively reaching for Jesus. "What is it? What's wrong?" The angel came again. Joseph said, already moving to gather their few possessions, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to pack efficiently while fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. Herod is going to try to kill Jesus. We have to get to Egypt. Egypt, the word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Egypt was far, days of travel through dangerous territory, a foreign land where they knew no one, where they didn't speak the language, where they would be completely dependent on strangers for survival. But it was also beyond Herod's reach, beyond the authority of Rome in this region, a place where they could disappear until the danger passed. Mary didn't waste time with questions or protests. Within minutes, she was helping Joseph pack, wrapping Jesus warmly against the cool night air, gathering the few clothes they had, the precious gifts from the wise men, the essential supplies they would need for the journey. Her face was calm, but Joseph could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear he felt in his own heart. They had perhaps an hour before dawn, perhaps less, before the town would begin to stir, before their absence might be noticed. Joseph led their donkey from the small stable behind the baker's shop, loading their belongings as quietly as possible, his ears straining for any sound that might indicate soldiers, searchers, anyone who might be looking for them. The streets of Bethlehem were empty, most of the census visitors having already returned to their homes, the town settling back into its normal rhythm. But Joseph knew that somewhere, perhaps not far away, Herod's soldiers were preparing to search every house, every room, every place where a young child might be hidden. They took the road south, toward the Egyptian border, moving as quickly as Mary could manage, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Joseph had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Every sound made him jump. Every approaching traveller might be a soldier. Every town they passed might be the one where they were recognized, where someone might ask too many questions. Jesus seemed to sense the urgency, sleeping peacefully in Mary's arms, as if he understood that silence was required, that their lives depended on not drawing attention to themselves. Joseph marvelled at the child's calmness, even as his own heart raced with worry and fear. On the second day, they met other travellers fleeing south, families with young children, their faces etched with the same fear Joseph felt. The news was spreading. Herod's soldiers had come to Bethlehem, searching house by house, and when they didn't find the child they were looking for, they had done something unthinkable. They killed them all. One fleeing father told Joseph in a whisper, his voice broken with grief, "Every boy child under 2 years old, every innocent baby, my own son." The man couldn't finish, couldn't speak the words that would make the horror real. Joseph felt sick, his stomach churning with a mixture of grief and guilt. Those children, those innocent babies, had died because of Jesus, because Herod feared the child Joseph carried, because God's plan had somehow led to this terrible tragedy. And yet, what choice did they have? What else could they do but run and pray and trust that somehow, even in this darkness, God's purposes would be fulfilled? They travelled by night when possible, hiding during the day, sharing what little food they had with other refugees, accepting help from strangers who risked their own safety to offer water, shelter, directions to safer paths. The journey that should have taken 3 days stretched into a week, then longer. as they took roundabout routes, avoided main roads, stayed away from any place where Herod's influence might reach. But finally, after what felt like an eternity of fear and uncertainty, they crossed the border into Egypt, into the land where Moses had been born, where Joseph's ancient namesake had once served Pharaoh, where God's people had found refuge before, and where they would find refuge again. Joseph looked back one last time at the land of his birth, at the hills of Judea disappearing in the distance, at everything familiar and safe they were leaving behind. Then he looked at Mary, holding their sleeping son, and felt his resolve strengthen. They were alive, they were together, they were safe, and Jesus, the child who would save his people from their sins, would live to fulfill his destiny. The road ahead was uncertain. Life in Egypt would bring its own challenges, but for now, it was enough that they had escaped, that Herod's reach could not touch them, that God's angel had warned them in time. They were refugees now, strangers in a strange land, but they were also a family, bound together by love, by faith, and by the awesome responsibility of protecting the Son of God until it was safe to go home. The city of Alexandria stretched along the Mediterranean coast like a jewel, its white buildings gleaming in the Egyptian sun, its busy harbour filled with ships from every corner of the known world. But to Joseph, exhausted from weeks of travel, carrying everything they owned on the back of a tired donkey, it felt more overwhelming than welcoming. This was where they had chosen to stop, at least for now, drawn by reports from other refugees that Alexandria had a large Jewish community, people who would understand their language, their customs, their need for help in a foreign land. But standing at the city gates, listening to the babel of voices speaking Greek and Egyptian and a dozen other tongues, Joseph wondered if they had made the right choice. Jesus had grown during their journey, no longer the tiny newborn who had slept through their flight from Bethlehem. He was alert now, curious about the world around him, reaching for everything with eager little hands, babbling sounds that weren't quite words but seemed full of meaning. Mary carried him constantly, protective and watchful, her eyes scanning every face, every shadow, still fearing that somehow Herod's reach might extend even here. Their first priority was shelter. Joseph led them through the crowded streets, looking for the Jewish quarter, for familiar faces or familiar sounds that might lead them to safety. The city was unlike anything they had known in Palestine, larger, busier, filled with people from every nation, merchants hawking goods in languages Joseph didn't recognize, the smell of unfamiliar spices and foods filling the air. They found lodging finally in a small room above a cloth merchant's shop. The owner, a Jewish man named Simon, who had fled Judea years earlier during one of Herod's earlier purges. His wife Rachel took one look at Mary, exhausted and travel-worn, holding her baby close, and immediately began preparing food, heating water, making them feel welcome in a way that brought tears to Joseph's eyes. "You're safe now," Rachel said gently, as she helped Mary bathe Jesus, as she provided clean clothes and warm food. "Whatever you're running from, it can't reach you here. Alexandria protects her own." But safety, Joseph discovered, came with its own challenges. He needed work, needed to find a way to support his family in this expensive city, needed to adapt his skills to Egyptian ways and Egyptian customers. The wood was different here, imported from distant lands. The The tools worked differently in the dry desert air. The customers expected craftsmanship that reflected their own cultural preferences. Joseph spent his first weeks walking through the city, visiting workshops, asking questions, learning how business was conducted, slowly building the relationships that would allow him to work. His Hebrew accent marked him as a foreigner. His unfamiliarity with local customs sometimes led to misunderstandings, but his skill with his hands spoke a universal language, and gradually opportunities began to open. He found work first making small repairs, fixing broken furniture, mending household items that other craftsmen considered too simple or too time-consuming. The pay was modest, but it was honest work, and it allowed him to learn, to observe, to understand how he might build a life for his family in this strange new place. Mary, meanwhile, was discovering her own challenges. Shopping in the markets required learning new customs, new ways of bargaining, new relationships with merchants who spoke languages she was still learning. The other women in their building were kind, but they came from different backgrounds, different traditions, and simple conversations sometimes became complicated misunderstandings. But Jesus, their precious son, seemed to thrive in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Alexandria. He was fascinated by the different faces, the various languages, the rich tapestry of sights and sounds that surrounded them. When Joseph carried him through the markets, Jesus would reach out to everyone, smiling at strangers, babbling happily in response to greetings in a dozen different tongues. "He's going to grow up speaking Egyptian," Mary said one evening, as they watched Jesus crawling around their small room, chattering to himself in sounds that seemed to include bits of Hebrew, Greek, and the Egyptian dialect he heard on the streets. "Maybe that's part of God's plan," Joseph replied, thinking about the diverse world their son would inherit, about the many peoples he would one day need to reach, about how growing up in Alexandria might prepare him for a ministry that would extend far beyond the hills of Galilee. As the months passed, their life in Egypt began to take on a routine. Joseph's reputation as a skilled craftsman grew, allowing him to take on more complex projects, to charge better prices, to provide more comfortably for his family. They moved to a larger room, then to a small house near the Jewish quarter, slowly building the kind of life they had dreamed of back in Nazareth. But it was never quite home, never quite the life they had planned. Joseph missed the familiar hills of Galilee, the rhythms of village life, the workshop where his father had taught him his trade. Mary missed her family, her mother's advice, the community of women who had watched her grow up. They were grateful for Egypt's safety, for the kindness of strangers who had become friends, but they remained, at heart, exiles. Jesus took his first steps in a house in Alexandria, spoke his first clear words in a mixture of Hebrew and Egyptian, learned to help his father in a workshop that smelled of unfamiliar woods and foreign glues. Joseph taught him the names of tools in Hebrew, but had to learn their Egyptian names as well, creating a bilingual education that reflected their complex circumstances. The wise men's gifts, the gold and frankincense and myrrh, provided security during those early months when work was scarce and every coin mattered. Joseph used them carefully, sparingly, knowing they might need to last for years, knowing they represented not just financial security, but God's provision for their exile. In the evenings, After Jesus was asleep, Joseph and Mary would sit together, talking about home, about the families they had left behind, about when they might return. They had no way of knowing what was happening in Judea, whether Herod was still searching, whether it was safe to even think about going back. "How will we know?" Mary would ask, and Joseph could only answer, "God will tell us, the same way he told us to leave. He'll tell us when it's time to return." And so they waited, building a life in Egypt, raising their son among strangers who had become friends, learning new languages and new customs, but always watching, always listening, always ready for the angel's voice that would tell them it was time to pack their few possessions and journey home to the land God had promised, the land where Jesus was destined to change the world. In Alexandria, surrounded by the bustle of commerce and the diversity of nations, Jesus grew from a baby into a toddler, protected by his parents' love, nurtured by a community of exiles, prepared, though none of them knew it yet, for a ministry that would reach every corner of the world they saw around them every day. The dream came on a night when the desert wind was particularly strong, rattling the shutters of their little house in Alexandria, filling the air with sand that seemed to get into everything. Joseph had grown accustomed to these Egyptian sandstorms, but tonight, as he lay listening to the wind, he found himself thinking of the gentle rains of Galilee, of the green hills around Nazareth, of the workshop where his father had taught him his trade, and then, cutting through the sound of the wind, through his homesick thoughts, came the familiar voice of the angel, the messenger who had appeared to him twice before, who had guided their family through the most dangerous chapters of their story. "Get up," the angel said, his voice carrying the same divine authority Joseph remembered, but this time there was something different in his tone, something that sounded almost like joy. "Take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Joseph sat up in bed, his heart racing, not with fear this time, but with hope. Herod was dead. The man who had hunted Jesus, who had murdered innocent children in his rage, who had forced them to flee their homeland, was no longer a threat. They could go home. He woke Mary gently, sharing the angel's message, watching as relief and excitement warred with uncertainty in her eyes. Egypt had been good to them. They had built a life here, found friends, established routines. Jesus was happy and healthy, speaking Egyptian as fluently as Hebrew, comfortable in the diverse world of Alexandria. But home was calling them back. The preparations for leaving were different this time, less frantic, less fearful. They had time to say proper goodbyes, to settle Joseph's business affairs, to pack carefully rather than grabbing what they could carry. The Jewish community in Alexandria gathered to wish them well, to press gifts into their hands, to promise prayers for their journey. Jesus, now a sturdy toddler, didn't understand why everyone was so emotional, why his parents were packing everything into bundles, why the familiar faces around him seemed sad even as they smiled. He had never known any home but Egypt, never seen the land his parents spoke of with such longing. The journey north was leisurely compared to their desperate flight years earlier. They travelled with other families, merchants and pilgrims making their way to Jerusalem for the upcoming Passover. their caravan large enough to provide safety, slow enough to accommodate children and elderly travellers. Joseph found himself watching everything with new eyes, seeing the landscape change as they moved from the desert into more familiar territory, feeling his heart lift as they crossed into Galilee, as the hills began to look like the hills of his childhood, as the accents of the people began to sound like home. But as they drew closer to Nazareth, Joseph's excitement began to mix with nervousness. How would they be received? What would people think of their long absence? Would his old customers remember him? Would there still be work for a carpenter who had been away for years? And then, as they crested the hill overlooking Nazareth, Joseph saw it spread out below them, the same small town he had left, the same narrow streets, the same stone houses, the same synagogue where he had worshipped as a boy, and tears filled his eyes. "We're home, Jesus," Mary whispered, lifting their son so he could see the town below. "This is where you were born, where your father learned his trade, where we're going to live." Jesus looked around with wide eyes, taking in the unfamiliar landscape, the different smells, the Hebrew conversations he could understand, but that sounded strange after years of Egyptian dialects. Everything was new to him, but for Joseph and Mary, everything was achingly familiar. Their first stop was to Mary's family, to Joachim and Anne, who had aged in their absence but who wept with joy at seeing their daughter again, at meeting their grandson, at having their family whole once more. The reunion was everything Joseph had hoped for, full of tears and laughter, of stories shared and love renewed. But it was Joseph's workshop that called to him most strongly. The stone room where he had learned his craft, where he had shaped his first piece of wood, where he had dreamed of the life he would build with Mary. It had been unused in their absence, his tools still hanging on the walls where he had left them, covered with dust but otherwise unchanged. Jesus explored the workshop with the fearless curiosity of a child, touching everything, asking questions in his mixture of Hebrew and Egyptian, delighted by the new textures and smells, the tools that were unlike anything he had encountered in Alexandria. "What's this, Papa?" he asked, holding up a small chisel. And Joseph felt his heart swell at the word, at the sound of his son's voice in the place where he had always dreamed of teaching him. "That's for making wood smooth," Joseph explained, taking the tool and showing Jesus how to hold it properly, how to use it safely, beginning already the education that would last for years to come. The town welcomed them back with the kind of warmth that small communities show their own. Neighbours stopping by with gifts of food, old customers inquiring about repair work, children curious about the boy who had returned from the mysterious land of Egypt. Joseph resumed his work gradually, rebuilding relationships, re-establishing his reputation, settling back into the rhythms of village life. Mary reconnected with her friends, with the women who had been part of her daily life before their exile, sharing stories of Egypt, of Jesus' early years, of the challenges and blessings of life in a foreign land. She began to feel at home again, to remember why she had missed this place so deeply, and Jesus, after some initial shyness, began to make friends with the local children, to learn their games, to explore the hills and valleys around Nazareth with the endless energy of childhood. He was different from the other children, more cosmopolitan, more curious about the world beyond their small town. but he was also unmistakably one of them, a boy who belonged in this place, who was meant to grow up among these people. As the weeks passed, as spring turned to summer, as their life in Nazareth settled into comfortable routines, Joseph found himself marvelling at God's faithfulness. They had been strangers in a strange land, refugees dependent on the kindness of others, but they had survived, even thrived, and now they were home, ready to begin the next chapter of Jesus' extraordinary story. In the evenings, as he cleaned his tools and swept the sawdust from his workshop floor, Joseph would watch Jesus playing in the courtyard and wonder what the future held for this remarkable child, this son who had already survived so much, who had been protected by angels, who carried within himself the hopes of the world. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges or joys awaited them, Joseph knew they would face them together, as a family, in the place where they belonged, in the town where Jesus would grow from a boy into a man, where the Son of God would learn the trade of his earthly father, and where the most important story ever told would continue to unfold, one quiet day at a time. There were mornings when Joseph would wake early, before the sun had fully risen, and find Jesus already sitting by the window, watching the light creep across the hills of Galilee, his small face thoughtful in a way that seemed far too mature for a child of 4 or 5 or 6. In those quiet moments, before the day began, before the sounds of the awakening village filled the air, Joseph would wonder what thoughts filled his son's mind, what dreams visited him in sleep, what understanding already lived behind those bright, curious eyes. Jesus was growing quickly, as children do, but there was something different about the way he grew, something that went beyond the normal changes of childhood. It wasn't just that he was bright, though he was certainly that, quick to learn his letters, eager to memorize the scriptures they read together each evening, full of questions that sometimes left Joseph searching for answers. It was the way other people responded to him, the way conversations would quiet when he entered a room, the way elderly neighbours would seek him out, asking his opinion on matters that seemed far too complex for a child, and then nodding thoughtfully at his responses as if they contained wisdom beyond his years. Joseph watched it all, sometimes with pride, sometimes with wonder, sometimes with a flutter of worry in his chest, remembering the angel's words, remembering that this child was not like other children, that his destiny stretched far beyond the quiet streets of Nazareth, far beyond anything Joseph could fully understand. But most of the time, Jesus was simply a boy who scraped his knees climbing trees, who came home covered in dust from playing with his friends, who helped his mother with household chores and learned to sweep sawdust from his father's workshop, who laughed at simple jokes and cried when he was tired or hurt. Joseph treasured these ordinary moments, these glimpses of normal childhood, these reminders that despite everything extraordinary about Jesus' conception and birth, despite the angels and the prophecies and the flight to Egypt, he was still his son, still the child who needed teaching and guidance and patience and love. Teaching Jesus to walk had been an adventure. The boy seemed to have no fear, toddling toward anything that caught his interest, reaching for tools that were too sharp, trying to climb onto workbenches that were too high, exploring every corner of their small home with the determined curiosity of someone who wanted to understand how everything worked. Careful, Jesus, Joseph would say, catching him just before he tumbled from something dangerous. "That's not for little hands." And Jesus would look up at him with those bright eyes, not defiant, not disobedient, but intensely curious, as if he were trying to understand not just the prohibition, but the reason behind it, the principle that made some things safe and others dangerous. As Jesus grew older, his questions became more complex, more thoughtful. "Papa," he would say, sitting in the workshop while Joseph worked, "why do some trees grow straight and others grow crooked?" Joseph would consider the question carefully, understanding that Jesus wasn't just asking about trees, but about something deeper, about the nature of growth, about the forces that shape living things. "Well," he would answer, selecting his words carefully, "trees grow toward the light, but sometimes there are obstacles, rocks or other trees, that force them to find different paths." "Like people?" Jesus would ask, and Joseph would nod, marveling at his son's ability to see connections, to understand that the physical world reflected spiritual truths. "Yes, like people. We all grow toward what gives us life. But sometimes we have to find our own way around the obstacles." These conversations became a treasured part of their daily routine. Jesus asking questions that challenged Joseph to think more deeply about his own faith, about the nature of God, about the purpose of life itself. Sometimes Joseph felt as if he were learning as much from his son as he was teaching him. Jesus' relationship with other children was complicated. He was kind, never cruel or selfish, always willing to share his toys or include someone who was being left out. But there was something about him that set him apart, a maturity that sometimes made the other children uncomfortable, a way of seeing through pretense that made adults nervous. "He's different," Mary would say sometimes, watching Jesus play alone while the other children gathered in groups that somehow never quite included him. Not in a bad way, but different. Joseph would nod, understanding her concern, feeling the same protective instinct that all parents feel when their child doesn't quite fit in. But he also recognized that Jesus' differentness wasn't something to be fixed or hidden. It was part of who he was, part of what he was meant to become. The boy was drawn to the synagogue in a way that surprised even the rabbi, sitting through the longest readings without fidgeting, asking questions about the scriptures that showed deep understanding, sometimes correcting misstatements with such gentle authority that even the adults found themselves deferring to his knowledge. "Where does he learn these things?" the rabbi asked Joseph one Sabbath, watching as Jesus discussed a complex passage from Isaiah with men 3 times his age. "You're teaching him well, but this goes beyond ordinary education." Joseph could only smile, remembering the angel's words, understanding that Jesus' education was coming from sources beyond anything he could provide. "He's always been eager to learn," was all he could say, not wanting to reveal more, not sure how much of their extraordinary story the community was ready to hear. At home, Jesus was helpful in ways that sometimes amazed his parents. He seemed to sense when Mary was tired, appearing at her side to help with tasks that were usually too difficult for children his age. He anticipated Joseph's needs in the workshop, handing him tools before he asked for them, holding pieces steady while glue dried, cleaning up without being asked. But it was in the quiet moments, in the evenings when they sat together after supper, that Joseph felt closest to his son. Jesus would curl up beside him while Joseph read from the scriptures, sometimes falling asleep with his head on his father's shoulder, sometimes asking questions that revealed the depth of his understanding, sometimes just listening with the intense concentration that was becoming his trademark. "Papa," Jesus said one evening, when he was perhaps 7 years old, "tell me about the night I was born." Joseph looked at Mary, seeing the same mixture of wonder and uncertainty in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. How much should they tell him? How much was he ready to understand? "Well," Joseph began carefully, "you were born in Bethlehem, in a stable, because there was no room anywhere else. And the shepherds came," Jesus added, as if he remembered, though of course he couldn't. "And the wise men, with gifts." "Yes," Mary said softly. "They all came to see you, because they knew you were special." Jesus was quiet for a long moment, processing this information, and Joseph wondered what he was thinking, what he was understanding, what questions were forming in his bright young mind. "Am I different from other children?" Jesus asked finally, and Joseph felt his heart break a little at the simple honesty of the question. "Yes," Joseph said gently, pulling his son closer. "You are different, but different in wonderful ways, in ways that make God smile, in ways that will help other people." Jesus nodded solemnly, accepting this answer with the grace that characterized everything about him, and Joseph marveled again at the privilege of raising this remarkable child, this son who was both fully human and fully divine, this boy who would one day change the world, but who for now was simply theirs to love and protect and guide. The first tool Joseph placed in Jesus' hands was small, child-sized, a wooden mallet that fit perfectly in his son's grip. Jesus was 8 years old, his hands still soft from childhood, but his eyes bright with eagerness to learn, to understand, to become part of the work that filled his father's days. "Feel the weight of it," Joseph said gently, watching as Jesus hefted the mallet, testing its balance, learning the tool before trying to use it. A good craftsman knows his tools, understands them, treats them with respect. They're not just pieces of wood and metal. They're extensions of your hands, partners in your work. Jesus nodded solemnly, running his fingers along the smooth handle, examining the worn head where years of use had shaped the wood to fit perfectly in Joseph's palm. Even as a child, he seemed to understand that this was more than just learning a trade. This was an initiation into something sacred, something that connected him to his father, to generations of craftsmen, to the very act of creation itself. The workshop had become Jesus' second home, a place where he would spend hours watching Joseph work, asking questions, learning the names of tools, understanding the properties of different woods, discovering the satisfaction that came from shaping raw materials into something useful, something beautiful. "This is cedar," Joseph would explain, letting Jesus touch the smooth grain, smell the rich aroma, feel the wood's lightness compared to the heavy oak they used for structural work. "It comes from the mountains of Lebanon, and it's precious, not just because it's rare, but because it resists decay, lasts for generations. That's why Solomon used it in the temple, why we use it for special projects. Jesus absorbed these lessons like a sponge, not just the technical knowledge, but the deeper understanding that came with it. He learned that choosing the right wood for a project was like choosing the right word for a sentence, that the grain of the wood told a story of the tree's life, that patience was required to let the wood teach you what it wanted to become. Joseph started him with simple tasks, sweeping sawdust, organizing tools, holding pieces steady while glue dried. But even these basic jobs, Jesus approached with the same intense focus he brought to everything else, understanding that there was no task too small to be done well, no responsibility too minor to be taken seriously. "Why do we clean the workshop every day?" Jesus asked one evening as they swept the floor together, returning each tool to its proper place. "Because..." Joseph paused, thinking about how to explain something that was both practical and spiritual. "Because the work we do here is important, not just because people need tables and chairs and plows, but because we're taking part in creation, in making something that wasn't there before. And creation, true creation, requires order, requires respect, requires reverence." As Jesus grew older, his tasks became more complex, more challenging. Joseph taught him to select wood, to read the grain, to understand how different pieces would behave when they were cut and shaped and joined together. He learned to use the measuring rod, to mark lines that were straight and true, to understand that precision wasn't just about making things look good, but about making things that would last, that would serve their purpose for years to come. "Measure twice, cut once," became their motto, repeated so often that it became second nature, but carrying meaning that went far beyond carpentry. It was about thinking before acting, about considering consequences, about understanding that some mistakes couldn't be undone, some cuts couldn't be unsized. The first project Jesus completed entirely on his own was a small stool, simple but perfectly proportioned, every joint tight, every surface smooth. Joseph watched as his son worked, marveling at the boy's natural ability, his patience with difficult tasks, his refusal to accept anything less than his best effort. "It's beautiful," Joseph said, running his hand along the stool's smooth surface, testing its stability, admiring the way Jesus had chosen the wood, the way he had planned each step, the way he had solved problems as they arose. Jesus beamed with pride, but it was a quiet pride, the satisfaction of work well done rather than the boastfulness of someone seeking praise. "It's for Mama," he said simply, and Joseph felt his heart swell with love for this remarkable child, this son who was learning not just to be a craftsman, but to be a man. As the years passed, Jesus became more than just Joseph's apprentice. He became his partner, his helper, sometimes even his teacher. The boy had insights that surprised even Joseph, ways of approaching problems that were innovative, creative, sometimes brilliant. "What if we tried it this way?" Jesus would suggest, when they were working on a particularly challenging project, and more often than not, his suggestions would prove to be exactly right, exactly what was needed. Joseph found himself looking forward to these conversations, these moments when his son's quick mind would find solutions that had eluded him, when Jesus would see possibilities that hadn't occurred to anyone else. It was clear that the boy had inherited more than just his father's skills. He had a gift, a natural understanding of how things worked, how they could be improved, how they could be made better. The other craftsmen in Nazareth began to notice began to seek out Jesus' opinion on their own projects, began to treat him not as a child playing at grown-up work, but as a colleague, a fellow craftsman whose insights were valuable, whose skills were worthy of respect. "Your boy has good hands," old Eli the stonemason told Joseph one day, watching as Jesus helped repair a damaged wall. "But more than that, he has a good mind. He understands how things fit together, how they work together. That's not something you can teach. That's a gift." Joseph nodded, understanding that what Eli saw in Jesus' craftsmanship was only a reflection of something deeper, something that would one day be revealed in ways that none of them could yet imagine. Jesus wasn't just learning to work with wood and stone. He was learning to work with people, to understand their needs, to solve their problems, to create solutions that served not just practical purposes, but human purposes. In the workshop, Jesus learned patience, precision, the importance of doing things right the first time, the satisfaction of completing a task well, the joy of creating something that would outlast its creator. But more than that, he learned the value of honest work, the dignity of labour, the way that serving others through your craft could be a form of worship, a way of honouring God. And Joseph, watching his son master these lessons, seeing him grow not just in skill, but in wisdom, in understanding, in character, felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond pride, beyond accomplishment, beyond anything he had ever experienced. This was more than passing on a trade. This was passing on a way of life, a set of values, a foundation that would support whatever extraordinary destiny lay ahead for this remarkable boy. In the quiet moments, when the day's work was done, when they stood together in the workshop, surrounded by the tools of their trade, breathing in the familiar scents of wood and oil and honest sweat, Joseph would sometimes catch glimpses of the man Jesus was becoming, the teacher, the leader, the saviour who would use these same hands, these same principles, these same deep understandings to build something far greater than furniture or buildings. He was building a kingdom, one lesson at a time, one carefully crafted relationship at a time, one perfectly measured act of love at a time. And Joseph, the carpenter of Nazareth, had the privilege of watching it all begin, in a workshop where sawdust danced in the morning light, and where the Son of God learned the simple, profound truth that all real work, all lasting work, all work that matters, is done with love. The journey to Jerusalem had become a treasured tradition, one that Joseph looked forward to each year with growing anticipation. Passover in the Holy City was unlike anything in their quiet village life, the streets filled with pilgrims from every corner of the known world, the temple bustling with activity, the air thick with incense and the sounds of worship and celebration. This year was special. Jesus was 12 years old now, old enough to participate fully in the religious observances, old enough to understand the deeper meanings behind the rituals they had practiced all his life. Joseph watched with pride as his son joined the other boys his age, listened with attention to the readings, asked thoughtful questions that impressed even the learned scribes. The week of Passover had passed quickly, filled with the familiar rhythms of prayer and sacrifice, of family gatherings and shared meals, of the ancient stories retold one more time, connecting past and present, linking their small lives to the great sweep of God's plan for his people. Jesus had participated in everything with the same intense focus he brought to all his activities, absorbing not just the words and ceremonies, but their deeper significance. Now it was time to return home, and the great caravan of Galilean pilgrims was organizing itself for the journey north, families gathering their belongings, saying farewell to relatives from other regions, preparing for the long walk back to their villages and towns and daily responsibilities. Joseph loaded their few possessions onto the donkey, checked and rechecked their supplies, made sure they had everything they would need for the journey. Mary gathered the women from their extended family, sharing final embraces, making plans for future visits, exchanging the small gifts that marked the end of a successful pilgrimage. The caravan was large, perhaps several hundred people, enough to provide safety on the dangerous roads, companionship for the long days of walking, help for those who needed it. Children ran between the groups, playing games, chasing one another, their laughter mixing with the conversations of adults, the calls of merchants, the general bustle of departure. Joseph assumed Jesus was somewhere in the crowd, probably with the other boys his age, or perhaps helping some of the older men with their loads, or walking with his mother and the other women. The caravan was like a moving village, with people constantly shifting positions, visiting with friends, helping neighbours, creating the fluid community that made long journeys bearable. It wasn't until the first evening, when they made camp beside the road, that Joseph realised something was wrong. He looked for Jesus among the boys, then among the men, then with growing urgency among all the families in their group. Mary was searching too, her face growing pale as the truth became undeniable. Jesus was not with them. The panic that filled Joseph's chest was unlike anything he had ever experienced, worse than the fear he had felt when Herod threatened their child, worse than the uncertainty of their exile in Egypt, because this time he didn't know where Jesus was, didn't know if he was safe, didn't know if they would ever see him again. "We have to go back," Joseph said, his voice tight with worry, already beginning to repack their belongings, to prepare for the return journey to Jerusalem. "We have to find him." The journey back to Jerusalem, walking through the night, felt endless. Every mile stretched like 10. Every hour seemed to crawl by with agonizing slowness. Joseph's mind raced with possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. Had Jesus been kidnapped? Had he gotten lost in the maze of Jerusalem's streets? Had he been hurt? Or worse? Mary walked beside him, her face etched with the same fear that gripped his own heart, but also with a determination that reminded Joseph of the young woman who had accepted the angel's impossible message, who had trusted God's plan even when it led through darkness and uncertainty. Jerusalem seemed different when they reached it, less festive now that the crowds were departing, more ordinary, more dangerous for a 12-year-old boy alone in its sprawling streets. Joseph began searching immediately, checking every place they had visited during the week, asking merchants, beggars, anyone who might have seen a boy matching Jesus' description. For 2 days they searched, growing more desperate with each passing hour, each dead end, each shaking head that meant no one had seen him, no one could help. Joseph found himself praying with an intensity he had never experienced, bargaining with God, pleading for his son's safety, for just one clue that would lead them to him. On the third day, exhausted and nearly hopeless, Joseph thought to check the temple, not because he expected to find Jesus there, but because it was the last place left to look, the final possibility before he had to admit that they might never see their son again. What he found, when he climbed the steps to the temple courts, was the last thing he had expected. There was Jesus, sitting among the teachers, the learned men of Israel, not as a student seeking instruction, but as an equal, engaging in deep theological discussions, asking questions that made the scholars pause and think, offering insights that caused them to nod with respect and amazement. The relief that flooded through Joseph was so intense it nearly brought him to his knees, followed immediately by a surge of anger, of frustration, of hurt that this child they had worried about, grieved over, searched for desperately, seemed so calm, so unconcerned about the pain he had caused them. "Son," Mary said, her voice trembling with emotion, "why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." Jesus looked up at them, and for a moment Joseph saw something in his son's eyes that he had never seen before, a kind of surprise, as if the boy genuinely didn't understand why they were upset, as if his presence in the temple was the most natural thing in the world. "Why were you searching for me?" Jesus asked, his voice gentle but puzzled. "Didn't you know I would be in my Father's house?" The words hit Joseph like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they revealed a truth that Joseph had always known but never fully grasped. This child, this son he had raised and loved and taught, belonged first and always to God, had a relationship with his heavenly Father that transcended even the bonds of earthly family. Joseph looked at the teachers surrounding Jesus, saw the respect in their eyes, the wonder, the recognition that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone whose understanding of spiritual matters went far beyond his years, far beyond ordinary human wisdom. And in that moment, Joseph understood that something had changed, that the boy who had disappeared 3 days ago was not quite the same as the one they were taking home, that Jesus was beginning to understand his true identity, his real purpose, his divine calling. The journey back to Nazareth was quiet, thoughtful, Jesus walking between them, still their son, still obedient to their authority, but somehow different, somehow more aware of the greater destiny that awaited him. Joseph found himself watching the boy, seeing glimpses of the man he would become, the teacher, the leader, the saviour who would one day leave them permanently to fulfill his mission to the world. But for now, Jesus was still his son, still the child who helped in the workshop, who learned his lessons, who brought joy and wonder to their daily lives. The incident in the temple had given them a glimpse of the future, but the future was not yet here. There were still years of preparation, years of growth, years of the quiet family life that was shaping the character of the one who would change everything. As they climbed the familiar hills toward home, Joseph treasured these remaining years in his heart, understanding now how precious they were, how fleeting, how important it was to make the most of every ordinary moment, every shared meal, every evening in the workshop, every opportunity to love and guide and protect this remarkable child who was both his son and so much more. The years that followed the temple incident were, in many ways, the the most precious of Joseph's life. Jesus returned to the rhythms of village life, to the workshop, to the daily routines of family and community. But something had shifted. Something had awakened in him that made even ordinary moments feel significant, charged with possibility. Scripture tells us that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, in favour with God and man, and Joseph had the privilege of watching this growth, day by day, season by season, year by quiet year. These were the hidden years, the silent years, when the Son of God learned what it meant to be fully human, to live within the constraints of time and place, to honour father and mother while preparing for a mission that would transcend every earthly relationship. In the workshop, Jesus had become not just Joseph's apprentice, but his full partner, his equal, sometimes his superior in skill and insight. The young man's hands, now calloused and strong, could shape wood with a precision that amazed even experienced craftsmen, could solve problems that had puzzled Joseph for years, could create beauty from the most ordinary materials. But it was more than technical skill that set Jesus apart. It was the way he approached the work, the reverence he brought to each project, the understanding that every table, every chair, every tool they created would become part of someone's life, would serve human needs, would carry forward the values they had built into it. When you make something well, Jesus said one day, as they worked together on a wedding chest for a young couple in the village, "You're giving a gift not just to the person who will use it, but to everyone who will see it, everyone who will be reminded that good work is possible, that beauty and function can go together, that someone cared enough to do their best." Joseph nodded, marvelling as he often did at his son's ability to see deeper meanings in simple things, to understand that their work in the carpenter shop was preparing him for work of an entirely different kind, work that would involve shaping not wood, but hearts, not furniture, but lives, not temporary structures, but eternal relationships. The community of Nazareth had grown to depend on Jesus in ways that went far beyond carpentry. When disputes arose between neighbours, they often found themselves bringing their problems to the carpenter's shop, seeking Jesus' wisdom, trusting his judgment, accepting his suggestions with a respect that sometimes surprised even Joseph. He has a way of seeing to the heart of things. Old Samuel the merchant told Joseph one day, after Jesus had helped resolve a difficult business dispute, he doesn't take sides, doesn't judge, just helps people understand each other, find common ground. It's a rare gift. Joseph watched these interactions with growing wonder, seeing how Jesus could listen to both sides of an argument, could help each person understand the other's perspective, could find solutions that preserved relationships while solving problems. It was as if he could see into people's hearts, could understand their fears and hopes and motivations in ways that allowed him to speak words of healing, words that brought peace. At home, Jesus was the son every parent dreams of having, respectful, helpful, attentive to his mother's needs, quick to assist with household tasks, gentle with the younger children who had joined their family over the years. He never seemed to resent the domestic responsibilities, never acted as if he were too important or too gifted for ordinary work. "He helps me carry water from the well," Mary told her friends, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Not because I ask him to, but because he notices when I'm tired, when the jar is heavy, when I could use help. He sees things, understands things, cares about things that most young men wouldn't even notice. But Joseph also saw the other side, the private struggles, the quiet moments when Jesus would slip away to pray, to think, to wrestle with questions that seemed to weigh on his heart. Sometimes Joseph would find him on the hillside above Nazareth, looking out over the valley, his face thoughtful, his eyes focused on something beyond the visible horizon. "What do you think about when you come up here?" Joseph asked one evening, joining his son on the familiar slope where they had walked together so many times over the years. Jesus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Joseph's heart ache. "I think about what's coming, about the work I'm meant to do, about how to do it well, how to do it right, how to do it in a way that honours you and Mama and honours God." Joseph felt tears sting his eyes, understanding that his son was struggling with knowledge that no young man should have to carry, with a destiny that would require him to leave everything familiar, everyone beloved, everyone who had shaped him during these precious hidden years. "You know," Joseph said gently, "whatever that work turns out to be, wherever it takes you, you'll always be our son. Nothing will ever change that. Nothing will ever change how proud we are of you, how much we love you." Jesus turned to him then, and Joseph saw tears in his own eyes, tears of gratitude, of love, of the kind of deep emotion that passes between fathers and sons when they understand that time is precious, that seasons change, that nothing lasts forever except the bonds of love that hold families together. The years passed quietly, each one bringing subtle changes. Jesus growing in physical strength, in spiritual understanding, in his grasp of the scriptures, in his ability to teach and lead and inspire. Joseph watched it all, treasuring every moment, storing up memories against the day when this remarkable young man would step out of their small world into his larger destiny. There were signs, of course, hints of what was coming. Jesus spent more time in prayer, more time studying the prophetic writings, more time asking questions about John the Baptist, the wild preacher in the wilderness who was calling people to repentance, who was preparing the way for someone, for something, for a new chapter in the story of God's people. And Joseph, watching his son's growing restlessness, his deepening sense of calling, began to understand that their time together was drawing to a close, that the boy who had learned to use tools in this workshop was ready to take up different tools, to build a different kind of kingdom, to complete the work that had begun in a stable in Bethlehem, that had been nurtured in a carpenter's shop in Nazareth, that would soon transform the world. But not yet. Not quite yet. For now. Jesus was still his son. Still the young man who swept sawdust from the workshop floor, who shared meals at their table, who made Mary laugh with his gentle humour, who honoured his earthly father while preparing to serve his heavenly one. And Joseph, understanding how precious these last quiet years were, cherished every ordinary moment, every shared task, every evening conversation, every glimpse of the man his son was becoming, and the Saviour the world was waiting for. There comes a moment in every father's life when he realizes that his son no longer needs him, not in the same way, not with the daily dependence of childhood, but has grown into a man capable of making his own decisions, following his own path, becoming who he was meant to be. For Joseph, that moment came gradually, like dawn breaking slowly over the hills of Galilee, beautiful and inevitable, and touched with both joy and sorrow. Jesus was 30 years old now, no longer the boy who had asked endless questions in the workshop, no longer the young man who had needed guidance in matters of faith and work and relationships. He had become something more, someone who carried within himself everything Joseph had tried to teach him, everything Mary had tried to nurture, everything their years together had planted in his heart and mind and character. The workshop was quieter now. Jesus spent less time there, more time in prayer, more time walking the hills around Nazareth, more time listening to the reports that came from the Jordan River, where John the Baptist was baptizing people, calling them to repentance, preparing them for the coming kingdom of God. Joseph could see the restlessness in his son's eyes, the growing sense that his time of preparation was nearly over, that soon he would have to leave the safety and comfort of home for the dangerous, unpredictable work of ministry. But what amazed Joseph, what filled him with quiet pride and deep satisfaction, was how much of their shared life he could see reflected in the man Jesus had become, the values they had taught him, the lessons learned in the workshop, the habits of prayer and study and service. All of it had taken root, had grown, had become part of who Jesus was at his very core. There was Joseph's patience in the way Jesus dealt with difficult people, with customers who were never satisfied, with neighbours who brought impossible problems to the carpenter's shop. Take your time. Joseph had taught him years ago. Listen to what they're really asking for, not just what they say they want, but what they need. Sometimes the most important work we do is helping people understand their own hearts. There was Joseph's integrity in the way Jesus approached every task, every relationship, every commitment. Your word is your bond, Joseph had said, over and over, until it became second nature. When you promise something, when you agree to do something, people should be able to count on it absolutely. Your reputation, your character, your worth as a man, all of it rests on whether people can trust what you say. There was Joseph's compassion in the way Jesus responded to those who were struggling, who were poor, who were overlooked by others. Joseph had never turned away someone who needed help, even when helping meant less profit, even when it meant working extra hours, even when it meant using his own materials for someone who couldn't pay. We have been blessed. Joseph would tell Jesus as they worked on a project for someone who was having hard times, not so we can keep all the blessings for ourselves, but so we can be a blessing to others. That's how God's love works. It flows through us to reach people who need it. There was Joseph's humility in the way Jesus never boasted about his abilities, never sought attention or praise, never acted as if he were better than others. Despite all his gifts, all his insights, all his obvious superiority in matters of wisdom and understanding, Jesus remained at heart the carpenter's son who had learned that true greatness came through service, through putting others first, through using your talents to build up rather than to show off. And there was Joseph's faithfulness, his steady, unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it cost him something, even when others might not understand. Jesus had watched his earthly father say yes to God's impossible plan, had seen him protect and provide and persevere through crisis after crisis, had learned that real strength came not from being loud or flashy, but from being reliable, being present, being the kind of person others could depend on. You know, Mary said one evening, as they sat together after supper, watching Jesus read from the prophets, his face illuminated by the lamplight, his voice soft but intense as he studied the ancient words. I can see so much of you in him, the way he holds his head when he's thinking, the way he treats people with respect, no matter who they are, the way he works, like prayer and craftsmanship are the same thing. Joseph nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire, everything to do with the knowledge that somehow, despite all his mistakes and uncertainties, despite all the times he had wondered if he was doing enough, being enough, he had managed to pass on something valuable, something that would live on in his son and through his son, in all the lives that Jesus would touch. But perhaps the most important gift Joseph had given Jesus was something he had learned in the workshop. But that went far beyond carpentry. The understanding that love was not just a feeling, but an action. Not just words, but work. Not just intention, but attention to the needs of others. Jesus had watched Joseph love Mary, not with grand gestures or flowery speeches, but with daily kindness, with partnership in the work of raising a family, with protection and provision and presence through good times and difficult ones. He had learned that love meant staying, meant showing up, meant doing whatever was necessary to care for the people entrusted to your protection. He had watched Joseph love him, not just as the miraculous child he was, but as the ordinary boy he had also been, correcting him when necessary, teaching him patiently, believing in him always, giving him room to grow, to make mistakes, to find his own way, while always being there as a safety net, a source of wisdom, a model of what it meant to be a man of God. And now, as Jesus prepared to begin his public ministry, as he got ready to leave the workshop and the village and the family that had shaped him, Joseph could see all of these lessons taking root in ways that went far beyond anything he had imagined. The son who had learned to work with wood would soon be working with human hearts. The boy who had learned to measure twice and cut once would soon be teaching others to think carefully about the words they spoke. The young man who had learned that the best work was done with love would soon be showing the world what God's love looked like in human form. It was more than Joseph had ever dared to hope for, more than he had ever imagined when the angel first appeared to him in that terrifying, wonderful dream so many years ago. He had been asked to be a father, to protect and provide for God's son, to teach him what it meant to be human, what it meant to live with integrity and faith and love. And somehow, by God's grace, through ordinary moments and daily choices, through shared work and quiet conversations, through the simple, profound act of loving his son well, Joseph had helped prepare the Saviour of the world for the work he had come to do. That was a legacy worth leaving, a life worth living, a father's greatest joy. The last mention of Joseph in the Gospel accounts is subtle, almost overlooked, like the man himself. Jesus is referred to as the carpenter's son, a title that speaks not just of his occupation, but of his identity, his connection to the man who had raised him, shaped him, loved him as his own. By the time Jesus began his public ministry, Joseph had already stepped back from the center of the story. His work complete, his mission accomplished, his son ready to take up the greater calling that had been waiting for him since that first night in Bethlehem. Tradition tells us that Joseph died peacefully, surrounded by the family he had protected and provided for, having seen Jesus grow into the man God intended him to be. There is something beautiful about the way Joseph exits the narrative. Quietly, without fanfare, without great speeches or dramatic moments, just as he had lived, with dignity, with humility, with the quiet satisfaction of work well done. He had been called to be a guardian, a protector, a father, and he had fulfilled that calling with faithfulness that never wavered, love that never failed, strength that never gave up. Think about what this man had been asked to do. A young carpenter, planning a simple life with the woman he loved, suddenly thrust into the most extraordinary story ever told, asked to believe the impossible, to trust God's plan even when it made no earthly sense, to raise a child who was both fully human and fully divine, to be a father to the Son of God. And Joseph said yes, not just once, but every day, in every decision, in every act of protection and provision, in every moment of patient teaching, in every quiet demonstration of what it meant to live with faith and integrity and love. When the angel appeared to him in that first dream, when Mary's pregnancy seemed to destroy all his carefully laid plans, Joseph could have walked away. The law gave him that right. Society would have supported his decision. No one would have blamed him for protecting his own reputation, his own future. But Joseph chose love over fear, chose trust over certainty, chose God's plan over his own comfort, and in doing so, he became part of the greatest story ever told. When Herod's soldiers came searching, when death threatened the child he had promised to protect, Joseph didn't hesitate. He packed their few belongings, took his family into exile, left everything familiar behind, because protecting Jesus was more important than protecting his own comfort, his own security, his own plans. When they were strangers in Egypt, when work was scarce and the future uncertain, when they had to depend on the kindness of foreigners, Joseph adapted, persevered, provided, because that's what fathers do, that's what guardians do, that's what love does. When they returned to Nazareth, when the ordinary years stretched ahead, when the excitement of angels and miracles gave way to the daily routine of work and family and community, Joseph remained faithful, present, committed to the long, patient work of raising a child, of building character, of passing on values that would last a lifetime. And in all of this, Joseph never sought credit, never demanded recognition, never insisted on his place in the story. He was content to be the supporting character, the quiet strength in the background, the steady presence that allowed others to shine. That's the mark of a true father, a true guardian, a true servant of God. The willingness to decrease so that others might increase, to work behind the scenes so that others can step into the spotlight, to invest your life in someone else's success, someone else's calling, someone else's destiny. Joseph's legacy lives on, not in monuments or memorials, but in the character of the man his son became, in Jesus' patience with difficult people. We see Joseph's influence, in his integrity in all his dealings. We see Joseph's example. In his compassion for the poor and struggling, we see Joseph's heart. In his commitment to his calling, even when it led to suffering, we see Joseph's faithfulness. The carpenter's son became the saviour of the world, but he never forgot the lessons learned in his earthly father's workshop, the importance of honest work, the value of patient craftsmanship, the joy of creating something beautiful, the satisfaction of serving others, the peace that comes from doing God's will, even when that will leads through difficult places. Joseph teaches us that greatness doesn't always announce itself, that the most important work is often done in private, that the most powerful influence is often exercised quietly, that the most lasting impact comes from daily faithfulness rather than spectacular moments. He shows us what it means to be a man of God, not through grand gestures or public displays, but through quiet obedience, faithful presence, sacrificial love, and the willingness to say yes to whatever God asks, even when we don't understand, even when it's difficult, even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. In a world that celebrates the loud, the flashy, the self-promoting, Joseph reminds us that true strength is often silent, that real power works behind the scenes, that the greatest men are often those who are content to be servants, guardians, quiet heroes who do their work and then step aside, trusting that God sees, that God knows, that God rewards faithfulness even when the world doesn't notice. And so, as our time with Joseph comes to an end, as we prepare to leave the workshop where sawdust still dances in the morning light, where the scent of cedar still fills the air, where the echo of patient teaching still whispers in the silence, we can rest in the knowledge that his work was complete, his mission accomplished, his love successful. The boy who slept in a manger, who fled to Egypt, who grew up in Nazareth, who learned to work with his hands, who was shaped by a carpenter's love, went on to become the light of the world, the hope of nations, the saviour of all people. And Joseph, the quiet guardian, the faithful father, the man who said yes to God's impossible plan, can rest in peace, knowing that his son is ready, that his work is done, that his legacy will live on, not just in time, but in eternity. Well done, faithful servant. Well done, quiet guardian. Well done, earthly father of the Son of God. Your rest is earned. Your peace is deserved. Your place in the story, though spoken softly, is secure forever. The workshop is quiet now. The tools are still. The sawdust has settled, but the love remains. The lessons endure. The legacy lives on in the heart of the one who learned from you, who was shaped by you, who carries your influence into every life he touches, every heart he heals, every soul he saves. And in that continuing story, in that ongoing work, in that eternal impact, Joseph, the carpenter of Nazareth, lives on, not forgotten, not lost, but quietly, peacefully, eternally, part of the greatest love story ever told.